environmental analyst in the Office of Climate Planning at the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. This webinar is intended to provide another opportunity for those in Connecticut to learn a little bit more about the grant funding opportunities available through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation's National Coastal Resilience Fund and the Long Island Sound Futures Fund. With the intended use to actually ask people questions for a little bit of technical assistance on your proposals and to ask deeper questions if they're not being answered. Wanted to just go over a few ground rules. Rebecca, can you advance? Oh, the Office of Climate Planning Director, Rebecca French, is also here to help with slides. Just as a note, this webinar is being recorded. You should have just had something pop up to say that this is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on the Climate Solutions website. We'll post a link to that in the chat in a minute. Attendees, please keep your microphones muted and stay off camera to avoid distracting our speakers during the presentation. We will have an extended question and answer period so that attendees can get feedback on their pre-proposals and Long Island Sound Future Fund ideas. So during the presentation, if you have questions about the grant programs that are more general, please feel free to put those in the chat and we will answer them as they're coming in, either in the chat or at the end of each presentation. We'll have a moment to have the speakers respond. Just note that the chat is public record. If you have more general grant questions that are more focused on your particular ideas, we would like for you to use the raise hand function. At the end of the presentations, we'll call for those questions. We would love for you to just identify yourself and your organization that you are representing. And if you're having trouble finding the raise hand function, you may also just note that you would like to have that discussion in the chat and we'll call on you during that time. And just note, if there's a disruption, we'll first try to remove any people that might be causing a problem. And if not, we might stop the meeting. We will then immediately restart it and you can rejoin using the exact same link you used to first join the meeting. And so our speakers today are from Throwe Environmental. We have Dan Nees, who is a project partner at Throwe Environmental, and he's also a senior fellow with the Center of Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland. Prior to his tenure at the Center for Global Sustainability, Dan was the director of the university's Environmental Finance Center. He has over 20 years of experience assisting communities in their efforts to finance environmental and sustainable development initiatives. And then we'll have Kyle Gray. He is a project partner with Throwe Environmental, and he leads the company's technical assistance work for the Southeast New England Program Network, and also supports Throwe Environmental's work as a field liaison for the National Coastal Resilience Fund and the Long Island Sound Futures Fund. And finally, answering questions in the chat and available for assistance is Taylor Throwe, who is a project partner with Throwe Environmental. She is a business operations consultant focusing on project management and data analysis. She helps to manage the company's work as a field liaison for the National Coastal Resilience Fund, as well as field liaison for the Long Island Sound Futures Fund. And with that, Dan will be our first speaker.
Thank you, Sarah. Again, my name is Dan Nees, project partner at Throwe Environmental. So I'm going to go through the first of the two programs that we're going to talk about today. And you'll probably hear this repeatedly, but this is the funding opportunity that is associated, as its name would imply, on resilience. And then Kyle is going to talk to you about a funding opportunity NIFWIP program that is focused more on water quality. And so we're going to be making those distinctions at several points in the conversation. But just to be clear, this is the conversation about the National Coastal Resilience Fund. You can go. First of all, Throwe Environmental is a consultancy located in Bristol, Rhode Island, and we, as well as offices throughout the Mid-Atlantic. We have been contracted by NIFWIP to serve as the field liaisons for the NCRF program. And in that capacity, we provide outreach to communities throughout the country that are eligible for this funding opportunity and help them through the process of basically translating their really good ideas and project ideas into strong proposals. We also provide follow-up for those communities and organizations that were not successful, but provide some feedback about what they can do to be more successful later on. And then in some cases, even support existing grantees through check-ins and troubleshooting, and just providing them resources for making their programs as strong as possible. So that's who we are. Just a quick overview of the NCRF program. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the program because it's been around since 2018. It is primarily supported through federal funding, but there are some additional partners, as you can see on the right there, of private sector and philanthropic partners. And in 2018, until just recently, the program averaged about $30 to $35 million a year. That changed dramatically with the passage of the infrastructure bill. And the fund is now beginning this year at $140 million approximately, and it will stay there for the next 4 or 5 years. So this became a very significant opportunity very quickly, hence the need for these types of conversations to make sure everybody has a clear understanding of what the program can and cannot do. Next slide. So the first thing to note is, again, as the name would imply, this is a coastal resilience fund, and there are resources available, as you can see at the bottom left-hand part of the slide there, to check out your community and make sure that they are eligible. These are resources and funding that are targeted to coastal communities. That is HUC 8 watersheds that drain to an ocean or the Great Lakes, or are adjacent to those watersheds. If you have a project that's kind of, on that envelope or right on the edge, or you're concerned about whether or not it fits into this this category or this area, again, go to that website. And if you have questions, then you can contact NIFWIF and ask them specifically. But it's really important that your community and your project be in this coastal area. This is not a national program for that reason, or I should say it's not a program for all of the 50 states, because again, it is entirely coastal in focus. Next slide. And so what makes for an eligible project? So this is the baseline here. This is what determines if your proposal is going to get considered versus, excuse the expression, thrown in the trash can. The first thing is eligible organizations. What is not eligible is actually a shorter list: federal agencies or employees of federal agencies, foreign organizations, foreign public entities, or unincorporated individuals. So that's definitely out. But that actually leaves a lot of different institutions that are eligible. And so this is actually a pretty comprehensive funding opportunity, because it allows for a lot of different organizations to contribute or to apply. And that includes states and tribal agencies, certainly local governments. We see, a lot of local government are applicants. Nonprofits are eligible, educational institutions. It's possible for for-profit organizations, but there are some issues, some distinctions there that are things that you got to be aware of. And again, that's made clear in the website that has the RFP. And then it is possible for semi-federal organizations, for example, Sea Grant colleges and things like that. But again, there are certain restrictions you got to be aware of. So please go into the RFP and check that out. If you have any questions on that, we can answer those questions for you. But for the most part, other than federal and foreign entities, this or most other organizations are eligible to apply. Let's assume you are an eligible institution, organization, or community. Then from that point, all competitive applications must have the following things. The first is your project must invest in nature-based solutions. That's, again, all three of these things are critical. They have to be there. So again, first is nature-based solutions. So if you are talking about a community, for example, that needs a hardened seawall to protect a road or homes or businesses, that is probably an extremely important piece of infrastructure in your community, but this would not be the appropriate funding opportunity to pay for that particular solution. But if you are talking about nature-based solutions to absorbing sea level rise or the issues that are related to climate change, that would be an appropriate use of the money. There has to be a clear benefit to community resilience. So projects that are very rural or very much wildlife based and away from population centers, though extremely important, may not be as competitive because there is not a benefit to existing communities and human populations. So this is, again, nature-based. And then part two, it has to have a community resilience benefit. In other words, it is protecting communities, businesses, and those places where people live. And then finally, this is the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. There has to be benefit to fish and wildlife habitat. Obviously, in urban centers, there's some challenges for making all of these linkages, but we've seen a lot of very strong proposals that have been able to do that. So again, there's got to be, as we all know, you can't maximize each of these variables, but you can optimize them. And that's what a strong competitive application will do. And then from that point, there are other criteria. So again, you're an eligible institution or community. Part two is you meet all three of those criteria that I just mentioned in the last slide. And then from there, the competition begins with these 5 particular things. The first is there needs to be meaningful community and partner engagement. This is especially important for resilience projects that are going to be crossing over different institutions or different jurisdictions. But the main thing that NIFWIF wants to know is that you have your community on board, and that different institutions, local governments, nonprofit organizations, even for-profit institutions are engaged in part of the process. The second is the solution to the problem is at a scale that fits the problem. Now, that doesn't mean that if you have, say, 10 miles of coastline that needs to be fortified or protected, that you have to address all 10 miles in a single proposal. It just need to know that you understand how this project fits into the larger goal, and that the scale that you've identified for this project makes some sense compared to how you've identified and how you plan for addressing that broader problem down the line. So project scale has to be commensurate with the identified problem. Number 3 is they strongly encourage innovative techniques and ideas. There are no set or delineated technologies or best practices that they are focusing on. They're looking for any innovative, new, or even tried and true opportunities for providing community resilience. But the main point here is that if there are new and innovative techniques that you've identified, they definitely will consider that, as long as you have all the documentation to show that there's a reasonable chance that it's going to be successful. Along with that is the need for transferring these techniques and ideas and methodologies to other communities or regions. We certainly understand that there are certain places that are very, very unique and are in need of very unique protection and practices to protect them. But and that's fine. And you should, if you're in that particular place, you should go ahead and submit a proposal. But it's really important to do your best to try to say how this will help other places, whether it's in your region or in other regions that are similar to dealing with issues that are similar to what you're dealing with. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, there's a real need and desire to invest these funds into communities that have been traditionally underserved as it relates to infrastructure investment. That can be communities of color. It could be socioeconomic in some of the poorer urban communities. It could also be very rural communities that maybe you have a pocket or community that's kind of off by itself and has not been served very effectively. But the main thing here is that this is meant to be a resource that's getting to those places that have been kind of left out of the investment process to date. So those are the 5 things that really will set apart one proposal from another. So these are the things that will make for very strong competitive proposals. There are actually 4 categories that they will fund. The first is a planning level, and then the 2, 3, and 4 are project level grants. And I'm going to go through each of them in a minute, but the number one thing to remember here, well, actually, there are 2 things to remember. The first is they strongly encourage you, to the point that you probably won't get considered if you try to straddle different categories. In other words, just submit an application for one. What they don't want is, a community planning, then a design build application is just not going to get supported. So do one of these 4 categories. Now, there have been some concerns with this particular issue that some project planners are worried that they would, not be eligible for funding down the line. That is absolutely not the case. NIFWIF absolutely supports pipeline projects, even though those that start at the first level of community capacity building and work their way to restoration implementation. Remember, this fund, first of all, will be around presumably for a long time. It was around starting in 2018, even before the infrastructure bill, but with the infrastructure bill, will be at its current level of funding for 4 or 5 years. So there is plenty of opportunities for projects to start at the beginning and work their way through the process. So really important to just put applications into one category. If you have a project that is completely ready to go, and in a minute, I'm going to go through each of them, but you've got all your permitting, the design is done, and you're ready for implementation and monitoring, then that's where you should go. So you're not required to start at number one. But again, the only requirement is you can't straddle project categories. So the first one is, again, community building, capacity building and planning. And through each of these, we give as you can see on the top right there, we give an estimated average award amount. There is no preset funding level for each of these categories. This is just what they anticipate seeing based on the 3 or 4 years of experience that they've had with these programs in the past. So again, there are no preset levels, but this is what you can kind of expect that a project within these categories, what you could expect for scale for a project within these categories. So the first one, planning and community capacity building, anywhere from $100,000 to $1 million. This is meant for that particular stage where you have a problem identified, a place or an area is threatened, part of your community is threatened, but you are definitely in the process of identifying where the solutions to that problem are. This is where you develop your stakeholder engagement, which is really important throughout the entire process, all 4 of these funding categories. And you basically plan what projects will be necessary. So when you come out of this, you have a plan, basically a nature-based project or suite of projects that will address the climate impacts and hazards that you're facing as a community. So that's the first one, community building, community capacity building. Number 2 is site assessment and preliminary design. This is that point where you get to that go, no-go decision where you either have gone through the first phase and you have a plan in place, or you've already had that done in your community. Again, the estimated award amount is $100,000 to about $1 million. But here, this is that, you can see that 30 to 60% design, go, no go. And this is the point where you've prioritized your planning activities. Now you're really getting down to the point where it's time to make decisions. You've had assessments done, you've had begun the permitting conversations. You certainly wouldn't have all your permits in place during this particular stage, but you have an understanding of what the permitting issues are going to be like. You might begin baseline monitoring. This is important, especially for a lot of ecological projects that require a clear understanding of where things were before you put the project in, so you can understand how successful it was down the line. But again, this is that point that just after planning and you've really got an idea of where you're going to go and you're taking the first steps to get there. Category number three is final design and permitting. This is when things are really starting to come together. Obviously, as you can see, the funding amount is about the same. Anticipated funding amount is about the same as the categories 1 and 2. When you're finished here, you should be very close to final design and permitting. Or entering into the permitting conversations. And so here, this is it. You know exactly what you're going to do, and you're going through all of those particular things that are necessary to actually get to implementation, which brings us to number 4, which is restoration and monitoring. And as you can see, this is where the award amounts jump up. Now we're talking about $1 million to $10 million. It's also the previous 3 categories were primarily 1-year type grants. They don't have to be, but usually they're about a 1-year grant. Implementation is different. We understand that this is where the real work begins, and there are issues that mean that could go 3+ years, plus even more time for monitoring. So that's why the numbers get much bigger. But as you can see, NIFWIF wants big projects. They want to really move the needle on resilience, and so they're looking for real implementation. So the numbers here in category 4 really jump up. The outcome here is self-explanatory. This is where implementation is happening. And then monitoring also implies implementation has been completed, at least initial implementation, and then you're in the process of monitoring to ensure that the project is performing as designed and as desired. And at that point, you have everything has been in place. Clearly, if you've gotten to the implementation, then permitting is taken care of and all those issues have been addressed. So those are the 4 categories. Again, do not cross over categories and don't worry about pipelining. That's exactly what NIFWIF wants to see. And some important dates. This is an active RFP and the pre-proposal is due very soon. So if you have a project in mind, now's the time to firm up that pre-proposal. If you don't have a project in mind, then you really like a challenge, but it's time to get going. But April 21st, by the end of the day, it's no longer close of business in the digital environments by 11:59 p.m. Pre-proposals have to be completed. Full proposals will be by invitation only, and that will be, those full proposals will be required by the end of, they will notifications by the end of May. Full proposals, again, will be due by June 30th. So it will be plenty of time to get it done, but it's not a significant amount of time. So it will require a lot of attention to meet that June 30th deadline. It'll get reviewed over the summer and the fall, and then awards announced, as most federal awards are, in November of 2022. So the big date right now is April 21 is your pre-proposal due.
So that's all we have for National Coastal Resilience Fund slides. I think we're going to pause here and we can toss it back to Sarah just to do a quick Q&A.
Hi, everybody. Again, I don't see any questions in the chat, but I do wanted to ask Dan, do you have any suggestions or recommendations for writing the pre-proposal for the NCRF?
I'm sorry, suggestions for writing it?
Yeah.
Well, you
I
don't
believe it's
have
pretty
a lot
short,
of space.
so.
Yeah, so pre-proposals are, in my opinion, the most challenging part of the proposal process, because what is it, Mark Twain said, if I had more time, I'd have written a shorter letter. So you really have very few pages to get a clear, succinct description of what you're trying to do. And that's the best advice that I can give. You can't obviously answer all of the questions that they may have in a 3-page proposal, but you just got to make a very strong case for there's a problem, a very strong case for those 3 main criteria that we mentioned, which is nature-based, it is community-based, and it also have a nature and habitat focus. So those are the best pre-proposals that we've seen, a very quickly and very strong case for those things. But yet, all I can say it is the most challenging part of the process.
I would say to add to that is make sure you focus on the specific details of the fish and wildlife impacts and the community resilience benefits, because we've seen a lot of people just gloss over the fish and wildlife impacts, assuming that because of their project, we would know what those fish and wildlife impacts are. So just make sure you go into detail, even listing the specific species you're trying to protect there. I think that is often a quality of a good pre-proposal.
Yeah, and I also, it's interesting that we're having a conversation today about two funding opportunities. The second one is a water quality fund. What we see a lot with pre-proposals and mostly pre-proposals, but also full proposals. These are coastal communities that have been dealing with water issues for a long time, and a lot of them are water quality issues. And while water quality may be one of those ancillary benefits that are associated with what you're doing, do not lead with a water quality solution, because that is not going to get funded. Now, if water quality is again, a secondary benefit, could be a very important benefit to the community, but that's not what's going to make it a proposal that's going to be considered. And so in the pre-proposal, that's got to be made very clear. It is a resilience project, nature-based habitat, those types of things. And then as Taylor said, in as much detail as you can in such a short amount of space, explain what you mean by that and how those benefits will be there.
Great. So we do have a few questions that are coming in the chat. And so I'll go ahead and ask them. And if you have your hand raised or you have a question, please put them in the chat where we can call them out. We'll do raised hands at the end of the presentation. But the first question is it safe to assume permitting for projects funded by NCRF will require SEPA or NEPA permitting due to the federal funding source?
It's not often we get stumped on the very first question, but we're going to have to take your name and get back to you on that one because I don't want to answer that incorrectly.
Okay. And the second question that's in the chat is, if a community has paid for and received a final feasibility study report, what priority category is next for them?
Well, that's a great question. And without having seen that feasibility study report, the best we can say is that it's based on the level of design. So if you're at that 30 to 60%, then you fit category 2. If your feasibility study has taken you all the way to 90% design, you'd be category 3, or you think you're going to get there. But if it's just basically articulated the problem and said, here's basically the types of practices or infrastructure you're going to need to solve the problem, that means you would probably come in at number 2 so that you could get at that first level of design. And so without having seen it, if you've had some design done, it sounds like you've probably met category 2. Kyle, correct me if I'm wrong. But that's really what will determine where you would come in. The other thing to remember is that the feasibility study may have been done by a contractor or consultant. All of those other things that are part of the first part of the process, the planning, which includes engaging stakeholders, all those other things, that's still going to be very important. And that will determine how far into the process of which of the 3 categories you go.
Yeah, so I'll just add on to that. With the first funding category, the capacity building and planning, the big outcome there that they like to achieve is a resilience plan. And that can be a plan that strictly comes out of this process, or it can be something that already exists. So maybe it is a feasibility study, maybe it's, a multi-community hazard mitigation, a resilience plan, something like that, but they want to see prioritized resilience projects that include nature-based solutions. So if you did have a feasibility study that did that, like Dan just said, you'd already kind of cover that first category or that first phase. So then you could move on based on what is included in that study.
All right, and then I have one more question kind of following up on the fish and wildlife benefits. Can you talk about how applicants might be able to better describe those benefits to fish and wildlife in capacity building proposals that may be more focused on planning, they're not project specific?
Yeah, so something Taylor mentioned earlier about, citing the specific species or anything like that, you can lean back on plans and studies that have already been done for the community. So if you've, completed studies for other projects, or maybe in a comprehensive plan or something, natural resources management plan, if you've identified those species of value, those critical areas of concern, all of that, you can bring that information into a proposal. And in many instances, you'll have nonprofits, universities, state organizations that are doing that research already. So you can pull from those broader documents to cite which species and, fish or wildlife.
Yeah, and to provide some clarification, and I don't mean to speak for Taylor, but I will anyway, that there's a different, what we're saying is that if you are stating that your proposed practice will benefit fish and wildlife, then you need to be clear about why you're making that statement and saying these benefits are here. But if you're saying we want to make sure, and we are going to, you're submitting in part 1 as a planning grant, you will say part of our plan will include how these practices and these technologies will benefit fish and wildlife habitat. So I think that the distinction is, if you're saying our plan will include that, great, then make sure you do that, and how you're going to do that and who you're bringing in to help you do that. Versus if you're stating, by the way, this berm or wetland or whatever is going to benefit fish and wildlife, well, then you're going to need to back that up with some type of information and research to show that.
All right, it looks like we don't have any more questions in the chat for now. So why don't we go on to Kyle's presentation?
Perfect. Thank you, Sarah. All right, so Dan covered our first fund, the National Coastal Resilience Fund, and the second one is another funding opportunity that the Throwe team works on. It's strictly focused on the Northeast in the Long Island Sound. So this program will span, you'll see in a minute once I pull up the map, it spans from, the coastal area of Long Island Sound all the way up into New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts, as well as the inland areas of Connecticut. All that being said, our work on this program as field liaisons really focuses on the upper basin states, as well as the non-coastal areas of Connecticut. So there are plenty of resources built into the program that support folks that are in the coastal zone, but our work as the field liaison team really is focused on the inland areas. So we're happy to address any questions that come from those projects that are in the non-coastal zone. And if you do happen to fall in that coastal area, then we'd be happy to direct you in the right direction to get the best resources for you. So again, this is our field liaison team. We have been contracted by the foundation to provide much of the same assistance that Dan covered in his presentation. We're providing general outreach about this program. We're giving guidance to folks as they develop proposals. And if you're already in the program, there's also some room for troubleshooting and any assistance on ongoing projects. That in mind, here's our email on screen, and obviously we'll go through a Q&A like we just did towards the end. But if you have general questions about how this program functions or how you even go into it and get involved with it, or if you have a specific project idea, please feel free to reach out. It's what we're here for. And if we can't answer your question, we'll find you someone who can. So like I mentioned, we're covering the whole Long Island Sound here, or the Long Island Sound watershed, spanning all the way from Connecticut up to Vermont and New Hampshire. But as I did mention, we're focused on the non-coastal or inland areas of Connecticut. Those boundaries are a little bit different for everyone, but for this program specifically, our area of focus as field liaisons will be on this area in kind of the yellow, green, or light green color up top. So I know this map is useful, at a quick glance, but in order to actually determine where you fall in the watershed boundary, there's a link that we can put into the chat if we haven't already, to get to this interactive map so you can see where that line is drawn and which portion of the watershed you would fall into. And I will just note that's especially relevant because there are different types of projects that are eligible in different portions of the watershed. So that's why they make this distinction, and we'll go over that. So this program traditionally would come in at around $5 to $7 million a year. But with that, boost of federal funding that's coming down this year to all of the different programs, we're looking at about $10 million for folks during this funding cycle. So it is an annual fund. We're not sure what funding will look like, in the coming years, but right now it's a historic level of investment coming in. It's a great time to apply. And it's just a good time to be thinking about how these projects can fit into this program for this year and moving forward. So everything in the Long Island Sound Futures Fund will tie back to broader efforts to improve water quality across the Long Island Sound. And that's all documented in the Sound's Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan. Most recently, it was updated 2 years ago in 2020. And in that update, there are 4 themes that come out of that plan that guide projects that are being put on the ground across the watershed. Of those 4 themes, there are 2 that are particularly relevant to folks who are in inland Connecticut. And those are the 2 that you see on screen. So theme number 1 talks about clean waters and healthy watersheds. And theme number 3 talks about sustainable and resilient communities. And when you're putting together an application for this funding program, if you are in the inland areas of Connecticut, these are the 2 themes that you would want your proposal to tie back to, because these dictate the type of projects that you can have and the outcomes that you're working towards as part of this program. So the first one focuses heavily on water quality. Most specifically, that's through nitrogen reduction. There's also some room to talk about phosphorus and sediment reductions. And as we talk about water quality in this program, improvements to water quality can be either from non-point source or point source projects. So that can be, green infrastructure projects that infiltrate stormwater runoff. It can be through retrofits to wastewater systems, can be addressing combined sewer overflows, be through ag projects. There are a bunch of different options here, and you'll see some examples on screen. The third theme, and the second one that can be included in inland Connecticut, is sustainable and resilient communities. And that really boils down to two different types of projects. So first, you have engagement and education projects, which focus really broadly on public stewardship, outreach, and education. That's all related back to the health and living resources of the Sound. So a good example of a project here would be maybe a school or a community organization that's educating students or volunteers on the scientific method and how to produce projects, or how to practice activities that improve the quality of the Sound. The second kind of category of projects that fall under this theme are for resilient communities. So that incorporates a lot of the same ideas that Dan talked about with the National Coastal Resilience Fund. So here we're looking at projects that address coastal hazards. We're looking at projects that will reduce flooding and erosion, and really get that idea of a dual impact. So community resilience as well as fish and wildlife. This category has been expanded this year in the 2022 funding cycle. So you can be anywhere in the state of Connecticut and apply for resilient communities. So as long as you go back to hazards that are tidally or coastally influenced, you're able to make that connection and kind of consider a resilience play through this program. I did just want to highlight a couple more examples of the clean waters and healthy watershed projects, because that's what most folks tend to be applying for here in this program. So as I mentioned, green infrastructure projects that prevent nitrogen loading, that prevent phosphorus and sediment, all of those will be competitive. If you're reducing nitrogen at a specific source, as I mentioned before, on-site wastewater treatment, we can think about broader watershed planning, projects that use natural infrastructure to slow runoff through stream bank buffers, or we can even go towards ag projects, thinking about farm scale conservation, best management practices related to ag, all of that. The key driving factor here, though, is reduction of nitrogen going down into the Sound. So if you're able to make that connection, there's tends to be a path through the program for you. So this project, or this fund rather, has two different types of grants that it'll award. The first is focused on design and planning, and the second is focused on implementation. A lot of folks tend to think that this program only funds implementation, and that's not the case here. If you have a project that you're trying to develop the design, you're trying to get to the point where you're ready to implement, you can apply for one of those design planning grants to develop those feasibility studies, to conduct assessments and designs, and get you as shovel ready as possible to potentially apply for an implementation grant down the road. So the planning and design grants come in at around $50,000 to $500,000. With this funding program, there actually is a hard stop with a minimum and a maximum. So you're not allowed to apply for anything less than $50,000 here, and you're also not allowed to break the $500,000 maximum. For implementation grants, the range is a little bit broader here. So it's $50,000 as a minimum and $1.5 million as a maximum. And we're looking at projects that will be shovel ready, implementable, and result in a quantifiable pollutant reduction going down to the Sound, or we're looking at projects that build resilience through community resilience and fish and wildlife. So again, hitting those dual benefits. As Dan mentioned on the NCRF, we have another similarity here, and that's that you should not be applying for design build projects or projects that straddle different categories. So here, if you are not shovel ready, then more likely than not, you are falling into the design and planning grant category. If you've done that and you're ready to implement, then you would fall into the implementation. So it's really one or the other here, but there is still that pipeline. If you're working on designing and planning, in a project this year, 2 or 3 years down the line, you might be able to come back in for an implementation grant. So match is something that has been, obviously an area of concern for folks in any federal funding program over the past couple of years. So we're really pleased to share that this program has reduced its match requirements significantly with this new round of funding. So typically this would be a program that requires a 2/3 match, but this year it's only requiring a 25% match of the total requested amount. So if you're requesting $100,000, only $25,000 would need to be your required match. Obviously very easy to calculate there, but we show you how to do that. And when we talk about match, they are pretty open with what you can consider. So it can be cash, it can be in-kind contributions, materials, other tangible contributions. There's a pretty broad range here. So that's something, obviously to consider as you move forward. And if there are questions about match, we'd be happy to think through those individually. Something else to consider, in building your proposal will be whether or not you need a quality assurance project plan, also known as a QAP. So QAPs are something that tend to make folks a little bit leery in applying for a program. But what we really like about the Futures Fund is that they have a team very similar to ours that, where we work in kind of upfront to get folks ready to apply. They have a team of QAP consultants that are there after you get funded to support you in putting together your QAP. So if you have questions about how to do that, the type of data that you would need, the reporting requirements, all of that, there is a team that is committed to helping you get through that process and to do so as easily as possible. So there are resources out there for you. The big thing to know when putting together your proposal and when you start to ask whether or not you would need a QAP is what the data is being used for. So if you're collecting data through this proposal that you'd be putting together for the purpose of making management decisions or prioritizing projects or where you're going to site a project, then you would need to complete a QAP. If you're collecting data, again, kind of going back to that education example I gave, to educate a classroom or to teach students about the scientific method, and you're not using that for management or decision making, you do not need a QAP. So it's really the intention that you have for the data and how you will be using that data. And again, we'd be happy to answer individual questions on that or point you towards the team of consultants that are specialists on this. So some general guidelines here just to start wrapping up. Projects in this fund typically start within 6 months of the award date. So if you were to be awarded in November, you have about 6 months to get started. They should be completed within 2 years after you're being notified of that grant award. If there's a large scale implementation project, though, they give you another year as leeway to finish that project and to wrap it up successfully. Just like the NCRF project awards will be announced in November of this year. And just thinking about the timeline again, you can backdate to a certain extent here, but you cannot go beyond October 1st of 2022. So you have about a month of wiggle room to backdate. Looking at eligible applicants, it's very much, kind of the standard bunch here. We've got 501c3s, state, federal, state and local and tribal governments, as well as nonprofit organizations and educational institutions. And lastly, some important dates. So this program does not have a pre-proposal. There's just one proposal, and that is due on May 19th by the end of the day. But they do have an optional feedback form for you to test ideas out and to get feedback from the actual program staff that operate this funding opportunity. So if you are interested in submitting this optional voluntary feedback form, we can put the link in the chat to that. And that form will be due the end of this week on Friday, April 22nd. Again, it's optional. It's a very short lift. They only allow you to write one page because this is too many of them. It gets really hard to think through and to consider and give feedback on. But it's a nice checkpoint for you to test out an idea, get some initial feedback, and build that into your proposal, which you would submit in mid-May. After proposals are due on May 19th, it's the same situation from there on out. So there's a review period that takes the summer and the fall, and then awards would be announced in November of this year. So if there are questions on this funding program, the same team will be here to support you as field liaisons. You can email us at info@throwe-environmental.com, or we can, talk during this Q&A and schedule something afterwards. But we are here to think through those project ideas and help you navigate both programs, and happy to do so. So with that, I will toss it back to Sarah. We can keep these slides up for a few minutes, and then maybe, Sarah, if you think it's the best move, we can take them down and just go into a broader Q&A.
All right, thank you so much, Kyle. I do want to ask a question that came in just as we were beginning your presentation, and I believe this would be for Dan. But what is the appetite for submitting two proposals from the same area when you have two different activities, shoreline protection and beneficial reuse of marsh interior, that are being progressed at two different timescale, i.e. shoreline protection implementation and beneficial use design and permitting?
Well, in short, there is no issue with a single organization or a single community submitting more than one proposal. And it sounds like the way that, and Kyle jump in too, but it sounds like the way you're describing it, it would be appropriate in this case because they're separate projects that have separate design and permitting and implementation and timelines and things like that. So that would be appropriate. Kyle?
Yeah. I'll just add to that. Everything Dan said is completely accurate. The only thing I'll add is if they were two, projects that were, pretty linked together, if there was a broader issue that they were both addressing, in many cases, both programs would encourage you to bundle those projects and to think about them together. And that's how you start addressing projects at scale and thinking about the idea of transferability. That doesn't sound like the case here. So this would be best suited as two separate proposals. But just thinking about that, for folks moving forward, if you can bundle projects and make a connection and make that a compelling case, then you start to get at that idea of scale.
Well, that also goes into the question from Josh in the chat about how many Future Funds awards one nonprofit organization can receive this year. If you want to touch on that, they're saying they don't want to compete with themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, there's no limit. There's no set amount of awards that will be awarded. So I would say, it's really a case-by-case basis here, based on whatever you think the most competitive projects are. From our perspective, for this year, having been brought in as field liaisons, we know that there's interest in getting projects funded and, successful projects in the door in the inland areas of Connecticut and up in the upper basin. So there's a tension there this year that could work to your benefit, but really it comes down to what will be most worthwhile for you and your organization in terms of capacity and, the competitive projects that you have.
Okay, we have another question. Are the in-kind services able to begin for the Long Island Sound Future Fund on October 1st? When would an applicant be notified in 2022 that their grant is awarded?
Yeah, so as far as I know, and Taylor, correct me if I'm wrong, you have that month to backdate, so you could backdate the match up until October 1st. If it went beyond that, I do not believe you can include it. If there are specific questions, we'd be happy to think that through. But I believe the rule of thumb is October 1st is kind of that hard deadline. And Sarah, can you just repeat the second part of that question? Sorry.
When would an applicant be notified in 2022 that their grant is awarded?
Yep. Good question. So that's actually right here on screen. Awards will be announced in November of 2022. No specific date yet, but that's, the rough timeline.
Okay, and then a question for everybody. How should someone decide whether or not they should submit a project to the Long Island Sound Future Fund or the National Coastal Resilience Fund?
So I can jump in here and then see what Dan and Taylor think. So these are just two of the several grant programs that are out there right now. So folks everywhere have some consideration to doing where they're going to be most competitive. If you're looking through these two programs, it's really what suits you the best. So if your project has a really strong resilience play and you're looking for a kind of large scale implementation project, or you're just looking to build broader community resilience in general, then the Coastal Resilience Fund tends to be a good fit for you. If you're making that connection back to water quality though, then the Futures Fund tends to be the better program, because the NCRF does not have that layer or that overlay that focuses on water quality. So if you're looking for a project that's heavily focused on green infrastructure or stormwater management, the Futures Fund is, the better place for you. That's just kind of a, rule of thumb that I've started to pull out though. Dan, Taylor, do you have anything to add?
Well, that's exactly correct. So if you're trying to determine which of the funds are best for your community, then again, it's that very simple calculus of resilience versus water quality. That's not exactly, I didn't hear the question asked. It was more, almost an existential question about should we go after this and what would lead to that. And I guess I would say that, first of all, if you're in one of the coastal communities or coastal areas that are delineated on that website, then the hazards you are facing are well known, well understood, and you're probably experiencing them already. So if you have a clear understanding that there's a problem and you need to solve that problem, and you believe there are at least opportunities for using nature-based solutions to solve that problem, then we'd encourage you to apply, if nothing else, for the planning grant to help you understand specifically what would be necessary. So I, as someone like all of you, I live in a coastal community, and I would see these resources as being essential, and it wouldn't be too hard to convince me that or any community in this area to go after these funds.
I guess one more point here is, you can apply for both. So if there are portions of, a broader initiative that you're, looking to push forward in your community, you can apply for components of that initiative through both funds. That's where you should, start to think about what each RFP and each program prioritizes, because then it starts to become a bit of a puzzle. But that doesn't mean, that there's anything wrong with that. You can totally go after both programs, and if both, proposals are competitive, then, that's just more to your benefit.
And that's a great point. And it just, those communities that successfully go after both have very good quality plans in place that make it clear why each of these issues are important and how they are linked, yet separate and appropriate for the different funds. So it's a clear indication that planning is paramount when it comes to going after multiple resources.
Great. We have a question about more of like a specific project type. Would a dredging project be considered? The dredging would allow keeping tidal connections to a large marsh area. Would that be something that would be an eligible activity?
Yeah, so there have been, well, I'm assuming this is for the National Coastal Resilience Fund. Sarah, do we know if that's what this question is about?
Didn't state which one.
Okay, well, I'm going to answer it for that, and then if the person who asked the question, is asking about the Futures Fund, we can talk about that. There have been dredging projects that have been funded in the NCRF. Obviously, there are some environmental concerns there, thinking about legacy pollution and what is actually in the dredging, and then where you're putting that and how it's being implemented. So it's hard to say exactly how a specific project would be competitive without having that information, but there isn't any part of the RFP that says dredging projects are not allowed and that they won't be considered. It's really how that would be worked into broader resilience projects, making the case for resilience, and just how competitive that is in the fund.
Yeah, and again, as Kyle said, there have been dredging projects that have been supported through NCRF. The challenge is in the habitat issue, and even in the nature-based solution, because it's, it depends on the context is everything in this case. And so a lot of times dredging projects don't meet those two criteria, but sometimes they do. And if you're able to make all three of those cases, then it would be there. And we have to go back to say this: there are no preconceived notions on technology. They're looking for innovative ideas that have applicability to multiple communities. And so if you can make that case that the dredging will meet all three of the criteria: nature-based, a resilience benefit to the community, and then fish and wildlife habitat benefit, then it would be at least considered.
Great. We have 2 more questions in the chat, and then we will go to taking questions about specific projects, ideas. But the first one is, would projects awarded CWSRF funding also be eligible for the Long Island Sound Future Fund funding? Example, wastewater treatment plant upgrades for nitrogen reduction.
Yeah, so for that one, yeah, I don't believe there's any, provision in the Futures Fund that says you would become ineligible if you have been awarded state revolving fund dollars. There are obviously restrictions on what type of match can be used, and federal match, federal dollars cannot be used as match here, considering this is a federal program. But Taylor, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the state revolving funds can be considered as match, and I believe they've been, successfully considered a number of times.
I believe you're right, Kyle.
Yeah, just to be clear though, that, and this may sound painfully obvious, but if you've received an SRF loan for an upgrade to a wastewater treatment plant, applying for a grant to pay for the same activity isn't going to go very far, right? So if you've got the grant and you've made the infrastructure improvement, then you've gotten the funding and you're going to pay for it through your enterprise fund. That said, if it's a continuation or you're building on top of infrastructure improvements you've made through an SRF loan, that would be appropriate. And then, there is a lot of gray area here when it comes to the Long Island Sound Futures Fund and point source upgrades. And the basic thing to remember is that if you're talking about basic level infrastructure improvements, so like you're just at the asset management stage, or you're just trying to stay in compliance, technically you can make an application, but it's probably not going to be a very strong application. But if you're going past that to deal with water quality issues, that would be much more favorably reviewed. And so again, if you've used an SRF loan to get you to that point, and then you'd like to go further, and whether it is in some types of enhanced treatment level or dealing with illicit discharge or something like that, that's beyond what you're required to do in your permit, then that would probably be well received.
All right. We have one more question. I know Connecticut has many communities with flooding due to stormwater. Should anybody be looking at nature-based or green infrastructure solutions for stormwaters to go to the Long Island Sound Future Fund, or to apply to the Long Island Sound Futures Fund?
Yeah, you should absolutely be looking
Absolutely.
at nature-based and green infrastructure solutions for stormwater. I think at least my experience first starting outreach on this program within the past year, initially I found that many folks were thinking this funding opportunity was only available for point source pollution. That is not the case. You can certainly apply for green infrastructure projects. They encourage you to do so. Of course, you have to make that connection to nitrogen reductions and connecting it back to the health of the sound. But in terms of best management practices and examples of projects that are eligible, green infrastructure is at the top of that list.
I also want to throw it back to the original question we had that stumped us regarding the NEPA permitting. I believe that it's going to depend on the project itself, so it wouldn't be automatically triggered. But if you are doing like a sort of a large scale construction restoration project, that might trigger NEPA. So if you're concerned about that, definitely reach out and we can talk about that in more detail.
So quick clarification, can applicants apply for the National Coastal Resilience Fund for nature-based solutions for stormwater, or is that solely for the Long Island Sound Future Fund?
It depends on what you mean by stormwater and how you define stormwater. If you're talking about a stormwater project that is focused on the Clean Water Act and maintaining your MS4 permit, that's not going to be considered. But if you're talking about stormwater as a mechanism for controlling flooding and erosion, then absolutely it would be considered. And this is part of why, so when Kyle said that communities may be in a position to apply for both, that's a good example of why. So you could have, we've worked in lots of communities outside of the auspices of this program where we've done financing work with communities that have both erosion problems as well as MS4 permitting problems. And they have to deal with both, often very separately, because they have an enterprise fund that's just water quality based. But they still have very much the same issues. And sometimes it's the same project that is helping them deal with both. But you got to explain how you would use both of these funding tools. So the bottom line with NCRF is it is not a water quality fund, but it could be a stormwater fund if that stormwater is addressing climate-based issues such as erosion and flooding.
Right.
And the opposite is the case for the Long Island Sound Futures Fund.
Right. Very, very important distinctions for both. They can be very confusing. So we're at the part, because we haven't had any additional questions come in, but we are now have the opportunity to, if you want us to talk about your project specifically with the Throwe environmental team, you can use the raised hand function on the webinar, and we will call on you and you can ask them specifically and directly. And alternatively, you can also put that question in the chat. Rebecca?
I'm going to raise so yeah, I'm a person who could ask those questions about the green infrastructure, because I think this is something, and in communities most recent past of the storms we experienced in 2021, we had massive flooding in many communities due to several tropical storms, heavy rainstorm events, so I think we do have a lot of communities who are thinking about how do they manage the stormwater. So so what you said there about how you define stormwater, I think is really important. So if there's I'm just sort of calling out if there's folks on the line who are maybe working in communities who are dealing with stormwater flooding, that you think about that. I mean, I know there might be folks thinking about designing stormwater parks. And is that a kind of a project that fits in sort of one? I mean, it might be in a both, but in particular, does it fit in NCRF? I'm pretty sure it would fit under Long Island Sound Features Fund, because it definitely has a water quality and community resiliency benefit, but I think it's a harder distinction for me for NCRF.
Yeah, Dan, do you want to start with that?
Almost certainly it would. And anytime you're putting the infiltration into an urban environment, and I'm assuming, Rebecca, you were referring to an urban environment. Yeah. That's obviously a water quality benefit, but you're also creating the sponge that you need to protect you from flooding, specifically nuisance flooding. Something to, if you're one of these coastal communities, this obviously is not a threat in the Great Lakes. They have their own unique issues that they deal with when it comes to water volume. But, on the coast, if you get a Category 3 storm, there's only so much sponge you can put into a community that's going to soak all of that up. So a lot of the flooding we're talking about is what we refer to. I'm from Maryland, and we call it nuisance flooding, as if there was a type of flooding that wasn't a nuisance, that's what we refer to it as. And really what we're talking about is sunny day floods, just because of the increase in both volume and sea level rise. It's constant. And some of these water quality based BMPs also would have a benefit of serving as a flooding and erosion mitigation tool. And again, if you're going for the NCRF, just lead with that and just say, this is what this will do. The fact that you have run an MS4 permit program and you're going to be able to report to EPA that you've been dealing with your permit by putting these things in place, that's just good for you. But don't lead with that in the NCRF, the water quality on the NCRF proposal.
Can I add a quick follow-up on how you might address the wildlife benefit? That's where I was Also wonder if that's a hang up for communities.
And it's often the biggest hang up, especially in urban communities, where we have so dramatically redefined what habitat looks like. And I guess that Kyle said something earlier that I think is really important, which is you rely on those studies and analyses of your particular community that have said this is what's going to be necessary to bring back whatever it is that you're dealing with. So again, we recognize the challenge in urban communities, but as best you can through the information that you have. If you're coming in at the beauty of the planning grants, by the way, is you really just need to say, this will be part of what we plan for. And then you talk about who the experts are going to be that can help you get there. But again, we recognize the challenge here, but as best you can, use the research that's available.
All right, thank you. I know I recognize names on this list, folks, so I have questions. I know you're working on projects with communities and communities, so this is your chance to ask some Q&A. And I think our speakers are also available for one-on-one if this just isn't the right setting for you, but you can also use the chat if you don't feel comfortable coming on camera or audio.
And I'll make a specific plug here. This is, a great time to talk about the National Coastal Resilience Fund in terms of projects, specifically because the pre-proposal is due on Thursday. So there isn't a whole lot of time left. Of course, if this is the first you're hearing of it, you're working under a really tight timeline. But if you're still pulling a pre-proposal together, you've got questions or ideas that you're thinking through, this, is a great opportunity to voice some of that and get some feedback now.
And for those people that did get into this late, and you just don't feel like you have the time, it's really important to reiterate, this fund will be around for a long time, but it will be around at this particular level for the next 4 or 5 years. So there are real opportunities in the years to come. So, you don't need to feel like you have to slam it through right now. It'll be here. And, even now is the time to be thinking about what you would do next year. So.
Question that just came in the chat is there a match for the National Coastal Resilience Fund?
That depends. So this year is the first time they've made a change to the matching requirement. It was a 1-to-1 match, which is kind of par for the course with a lot of federal funds. So now instead of match being required, match is encouraged. But I think NIFWIF recognizes there are some communities where match is just a very significant hurdle to overcome. And so match is, again, not required, but is encouraged. That said, and Kyle, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I would suggest that you really want to do everything you can to bring match in as best you can to make your project more competitive. So a competitive proposal will have a strong match component, but it's not required to submit a proposal.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Dan. Maybe one other thing to flag while we wait for folks to put in project ideas. I know we were talking about stormwater parks before, and that just got me thinking. We've heard a lot from folks, specifically on the East Coast and in the Northeast, about projects that will enhance recreation and public access in terms of applying for the National Coastal Resilience Fund. And I just want to make sure that's clear and to flag that for you all, that those are kind of another set of benefits that can come out of a project that should not be placed front and center in a proposal for the NCRF. So again, it comes back to resilience, fish and wildlife benefit, and nature-based solutions. Public access and recreation are obviously key components to several different types of projects, but those should be kind of supporting detail for a project that is resilience focused. So if you're thinking about a project that works in a state park or a community park, lead with the resilience benefits and then highlight, recreation and public access as something that's kind of secondary in that application.
We just had another question come in kind of just the ongoing challenge is making sure that you differentiating between the two programs. But is a pre-proposal needed for the Sustainable and Resilient Communities funding opportunity under the Long Island Sound Future Fund?
So it is not. So just to clarify for everyone else, that is one of the types of projects, the Sustainable and Resilient Communities is one of the types of projects that you can apply for under the Long Island Sound Futures Fund. The Futures Fund does not require a pre-proposal. It is just one proposal that's due on May 19th. That being said, though, you do have the option to submit that idea feedback form. It's a quick one-page write-up about your project, just answering a few questions. And that's like a really, really, really informal pre-proposal that you can submit if you like, just to get some feedback and to start thinking through an idea based on the comments that you get from the program staff. That being said, though, you don't have to do that if you're under any time constraints. And none of the categories of the Futures Fund, including Sustainable and Resilient Communities, will require that feedback form. And I can put that the link to the form itself in the chat. I'll do that in just a minute.
Rebecca?
I'm going to ask another question because we heard this in a meeting that our team had with Joanne Throwe, who's not here today. She's off today, but we had the rest of her team here. That, you know, the Connecticut communities were sort of going to Throwe individually, and she was advising multiple municipalities to potentially work together, in particular because as everyone here from Connecticut knows, we don't have a large swaths of undeveloped land. And so our projects tend to be, smaller and just inherent to our geography and geology as well. That tends to be where it is. So she was advising communities to get together. So it's just, if the folks on here want to expand on like maybe why Throwe is advising that and, how Throwe might be able to help. Again, we're getting very close to the pre-proposal, so you probably want to call up your colleagues today if you're going to submit a joint pre-proposal. But yeah, you can expand on that.
Well, the primary reason is for what Rebecca, you just described, which is the geography that we're dealing with here. Connecticut is, highly developed. And so if multiple communities are sharing the same resource, are being impacted in a similar way, and they're next to each other, then that makes sense to try to, you can't solve the problem on your own. You have to have other communities engaged. And that's probably the best way to put it. If your plans show that the threat or the hazards that you're facing are outside of your capacity as a community to deal with on your own, you have to have a regional approach. Then it's just going to make for a much stronger proposal to say, we recognize it's a regional approach. And so we brought in our communities to work with us. The other thing that the interesting thing you just mentioned, which is the projects tend to be smaller. That is true, though in urban environments, they tend to be a lot more expensive because projects are primarily based on real estate value, and that just goes up. And then also just everything in a hardened environment gets more expensive. But that's why communities often want to aggregate. So it's lots of little things that you're adding up to a big thing, and just scale the capacity increases when you have multiple communities that are able to address this. And I'm hesitate to bring up this example because we've been saying over and over, this is not a stormwater quality fund, but we have made this, we have worked with lots of communities. And I say, Joanne and I have worked in lots of communities to get them to work collaboratively on a stormwater water quality environment. So whether through enterprise funds or however they're doing it. And that is absolutely the case when it comes to resilience and flooding and climate change issues. So she's not here, but I would suspect that's what she was saying. You have a problem that requires a regional approach, you're going to want to bring in your partners, or else you're kind of saying, yeah, we know that everybody else has to do it too, but it's just us. That's probably not going to go very far.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I just want to clarify again, because we're talking about 2 grant programs. My question was really about National Coastal Resilience Fund.
Yeah, and then and I think that's what she was referring to. And by the way, I don't know, and I apologize that I'm not as familiar with Connecticut and Long Island Sound as I am with places north and obviously south where I live. But it's important to point out that this fund also has a much bigger component related to defense communities. And so if you are in a community that is a partner with a defense installation and you have a resilience project there, you should consider that very strongly, that there are resources in NCRF that they're going to target those communities specifically. So we didn't bring that up today because that's usually a conversation that is specifically asked of us. But I know there are a lot of defense installations and certainly a heavy presence of the military in that part of the world. So if that's one of your communities, then we would encourage you to get a proposal in.
All right. Seeing we have no more questions coming in, I think we may want to give people 15 minutes of their time back and end a little bit early, if that's okay. A recording will be posted on the DEEP climate change website. I'm going to put a link to that in the chat. Thank you all for attending, and a huge thank you for Environmental's team, to Dan, to Kyle, and to Taylor for your assistance. And just note that, Kyle just put the email address for their team in the chat. Please email them. And I also put a note in the chat that if you're also looking for assistance with the Long Island Sound Futures Fund, you can contact 2 extension specialists with Sea Grant